What if the apocalypse Jesus warned about wasn't a falling sky, but a freezing of the heart? A slow, silent extinction of love that leaves humanity biologically alive and spiritually dead. What if that warning, misunderstood for 2 millennia, was meant to name an inner collapse, the erosion of our capacity to care, to feel, to be present? That is the claim that changed everything for a man named John Miller one sleepless night, and it is the thread I want you to follow with me now. If this is landing with you, if you've noticed the numbness in your own family, the way conversations skim the surface, or the nights when your chest tightens and sleep won't come, stay with this until the end of this segment. If you want the guided exercise and the longer protocol that grew out of John's experience, check the pinned comment for the ebook linked there. I met John through a mutual friend who insisted I listen. He described him simply: 61, a third-generation farmer, the kind of man you recognize in the way his hands move, small, deliberate gestures. When he laughed, he did so like someone who'd learned the sound could be rare. He and his wife, Mary, lived on a strip of land that smelled of cut hay and diesel, where the horizon was a soft, constant line, and the night sky was only interrupted by the distant blink of a country road. They had a neighbor, Harold, who brought over eggs and the kind of gossip that is actually care. John's days followed the rhythms of the land: fix a fence, check a gate, cajole a stubborn tractor into life, sit on the back step with a cup of bitter coffee as the sun opened. But there was a thread of unease he could not name. He told me, almost apologetically, that he began to lose sleep around the time his youngest grandchild started school. It wasn't worry about bills or weather predictions. It was something more diffuse, a sense that the world had thinned in a way that left him exposed. Night after night he lay awake listening to the house breathe, and what he heard was the flutter of a larger collective anxiety pressing against the windows. Insomnia is rarely just insomnia. It is often the language the body uses to say something is off. For John, it phrased itself in imagery and a felt sense, a dull ache behind the sternum that felt like a small, organizing grief. He began to notice it not only in himself, but in the people around him. Mary, once present in a quiet, steady way, started to drift into a distractedness that made dinner table talk skitter. Harold complained of headaches that came without warning. At the church potluck, conversations became shorter, kinder gestures thinner. John felt an accumulative numbness he could not explain, and it scared him. On an ordinary Tuesday, after a day of repairing a fence that collapsed under last winter's ice, John found himself awake at 2 a.m. He told me later that the hour has a kind of vulnerability to it. It sits at the edge of night where sleep has failed and the day's armor is gone. He went out to the porch with his hands jammed into the pockets of his coat, thinking maybe the cold would settle his thoughts. The field sat like a dark bowl beyond the porch light. The air was crisp enough to taste metal on the tongue. The stars were sharp, but something about the night felt muted, like a radio slowly being turned down. He thought at first that the silence was ordinary. Then, very suddenly, the world simplified. The wind smoothed, the crickets cut off mid-note. It was as if someone pressed a palm to the landscape. John described the moment later with a word he kept returning to: mute. Not the absence of sound, but a kind of clearing. All the small noises that usually arranged themselves into the background fell away, leaving a sharpness in the chest that had nothing to do with cold. He noticed, with the raw clarity of someone awake in the dark, that his own breath sounded too loud in his ears. And then he heard a voice. Not spoken, not formed from vocal cords. It came as meaning first, like a set of sentences already finished, arriving without the mediation of speech. It was slow, impatient, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In John's telling, the presence that accompanied the voice was luminous, not a point source like a lamp, nor a creature in the sense he was used to seeing. It shifted geometry and texture as he watched, sometimes folding like an origami of light, then stretching into a column whose surface shimmered like oil on water. It did not cast a shadow on the field. It felt, by contrast, warm in the center of his chest, as if someone had set a small sun there and asked him to hold it. The thing, I will call it the presence, because that is how John spoke of it, communicated in images and impressions as much as in direct thought, a flock of things at once that arranged themselves into meaning. John saw not only pictures, but layered memories that were not all his. They arrived with the authority of a dream that knows itself to be true. Among them were scenes from long ago, a crowded street where a man spoke about seeds and lamps and inner rooms, a hillside where the posture of a teacher made sense not because of the sound of his words, but because the faces around him softened. The presence showed John those moments, and then it pointed to a different map, the map of our own interior landscape. This is where listeners tend to press, critiquing, wondering about sleep paralysis, wondering if the mind had made a mismatch of memory and sensory threshold. I asked John about that. He was clear. He was not hallucinating in a way that felt fear or delusion. The experience had a coherence beyond him. It arrived with information that he did not possess, and with a tenderness that resisted being reduced to mere neurological misfiring.
He made a choice in the field, to receive, to pay attention, rather than to fight or run. What the presence conveyed began, surprisingly, with Jesus. Now pause here. I am not saying an extraterrestrial being rewrote Scripture, nor am I presenting the experience as an argument against established theology. The account is careful, and so must we be. What John reported was that the presence used the figure of Jesus as a kind of translator, not to correct Scripture, but to refract it, to point at hidden currents beneath familiar phrases. In the impressions John received, Jesus' words about the love of many growing cold, about signs in the sun and moon, about the kingdom being within you, were not forecasts of external events alone. They were diagnostic metaphors, alerting listeners to patterns of interior atrophy. In one image, John saw a narrow road crowded with people who kept their hands in their pockets. A teacher walked among them, speaking in parables about seeds that fell on different soils. In the vision, the seed was not just a symbol of belief, but of a felt capacity. It was the ability to sustain attention, to hold another's experience without immediately measuring it against one's own agenda. The teacher's voice threaded through scenes of people whose eyes flickered away, whose gestures were polite but distant. In another impression, the signs in the heavens were shown as internal weather, hearts that tilted towards fear, mouths that hardened into statements meant to win rather than to heal. The presence did not say, "This is literal prophecy," but it did insist that the original warnings had a layer rarely acknowledged. They were about the erosion of relational capacity. John remembers asking in his mind, "Why show me this? Why now?" The presence's answer, which he felt more than heard, was spare. Because love is failing softly. There is a pattern here, not in everything, not irreversibly, but a pattern that can be shifted. This is the first crucial pivot in the story. The being reframed a familiar line, "The love of many will grow cold,"
not as an apocalyptic headline about the end of time, but as a clinical observation about a population-level phenomenon, a gradual desiccation of responsiveness that shows up as anxiety, relational fragmentation, and a hollowed-out kind of functioning that looks like life on the surface, but is missing inner warmth. Think of a people who can keep the lights on, who can run institutions, who can maintain productivity, but who cannot truly receive each other. That, in the account, is a kind of death. What followed in the field was largely experiential teaching. The presence, using images and felt states, described love not as an ethical obligation, nor as a mere emotion, but as a kind of resonance produced by a heart that can be intentionally oriented.
It used words like frequency, coherence, and field, not as technical jargon with hard numbers, but as metaphors pointing to the fact that how we exist inside affects the space around us. John felt in the center of his chest a sort of hum that seemed to expand when he held to certain images. The first time the presence showed him a child's small hand in an adult's larger one, a memory of someone forgiving another, a memory of being truly seen without judgment. Each image made the center of his chest warm and steady. When the presence asked him to carry that warmth, to allow it to expand beyond the edges of his skin, he felt something like a ripple move across the field. I'd like to be transparent here about language. This is not a transcript of Scripture. When John recounts Jesus' sayings in the vision, he uses paraphrase and interpretive framing. In this account, Jesus' warning reads like an alarm about the heart. That's an important qualifier. The encounter is presented as a testimony, one man's experience and the meaning he derived from it. It is compelling, not compulsory. The presence then connected those inner conditions to outer phenomena that we recognize, an epidemic of insomnia and anxiety, relationships that reduce to utility, children growing up habituated to screens and polarized narratives, political disagreement that pulses with contempt rather than curiosity. These were not presented as caused solely by external systems. The being suggested a feedback loop. A weakening of our capacity to hold one another attenuates trust and intimacy, which in turn feeds fear, which then hardens the social fabric further. This loop, left unattended, produces a culture that functions without heart. John's immediate question, again in his mind, was practical. Can it be reversed? The presence's reply came in a way that tightened the narrative. It did not promise a political fix or a quick technology to change the minds of leaders. Instead, it said that reversal begins at the level of felt experience, by recalibrating what the heart communicates. The presence showed John small acts and asked him to practice them, not grand gestures, but micro-practices that changed the felt state inside the body. It described the heart as an organ with the capacity to radiate coherence, which attracted a different quality of encounter. If this language of fields and frequency sounds strange in a Christian register, know that John struggled with that too. The presence did not come dressed in secular science. It came as something that could speak across categories, religious, scientific, folkloric, and did so in order to be understood. The teaching braided together images familiar to the faith tradition and metaphors from a language of resonance.
The presence pointed to the Beatitudes and to parables, and then to the mundane, a neighbor who listens instead of scoring a point, a parent who breathes with a frightened child until their pulse slows, a spouse who looks past distraction and sees the small grief under the words. We should pause and say something about the contamination of modern life that the presence emphasized. It was not primarily a critique of institutions. There was no sermon aimed at pastors or politicians per se. The critique was directed at habits. The presence showed John a town square where people spoke in slogans instead of questions.
It showed houses where family members ate under the same roof but lived in separate emotional atmospheres. These scenes were not apocalyptic spectacles. They were ordinary dysfunction elevated to the level of a pattern. The upshot: if many people live with numbed hearts, the collective field loses its capacity for repair. That is when the presence did something that startled John. It asked him to remember a specific time of warmth. Not a philosophical concept, but a memory with tactile detail. It guided him to recall the first time his daughter clumsily tied her shoe and how he waited with a patience that felt like a small offering. It asked him to place his attention in the center of his chest and to feel the memory as if the sensation were present now. As he did, he reported that the room, or the field, felt different. The warmth he summoned was not imagination alone. It had a weight, an extension. The presence said something that has echoed through every conversation I had about John's account. You are what you radiate. There are two immediate responses one might have to that: skepticism and practical curiosity. Skepticism is legitimate. Experiences like John's can be interpreted in multiple ways. Neuroscience would point to pattern making in a brain primed by stress. Psychologists would emphasize the role of sleep and trauma. Spiritual seekers would sit at the edge of possibility and hunger for method. The account does not ask you to suspend your critique. Instead, it invites you to notice. What if small, repeated recalibrations of inward attention had larger effects than we assume? After the first night in the field, John did not feel like a missionary called to a public crusade. He felt raw and urgent and privately implicated. He returned to his house and tried to hold the memory the presence had given him. At dawn, he made coffee and did not think of the tractor. He sat with his hands wrapped around the mug, breathing and attempting to place attention in the chest the way the presence had shown him. The first attempts were awkward. The warmth flickered. Old habits, the mind's quick agenda, the list of tasks kept intruding. But for brief stretches, he could feel a steadiness that was not merely relief. It was a capacity to meet another thing without judgment. He began, tentatively, to extend the practice.
In the days that followed, he tried, when he spoke with Mary, to bring that felt state into conversation, to listen more than to fix, to ask what it felt like to be her rather than what plans they should make. He noticed small shifts. Mary's shoulders unknotted in a way they had not. She lingered more at the table. Harold, who delivered eggs and the day's neighborhood buzz, started staying longer, his jokes carrying an ease that was new. The changes were small, they were not miraculous, but they were visible. The presence had also made a larger claim, conveyed in the language of plurality, that individual radiance can contribute to a collective field. It used the metaphor of drops forming a lake. The suggestion was not mystical in the sense of offering secret power over people. Rather, it named a practice-based hypothesis. If enough people, through intention and disciplined attention, cultivated an inner coherence that could be felt, the field would shift. The presence offered an estimate, a number, but immediately softened it. An approximate quorum, it said, that allows the field to tip. John remembers the phrase as an invitation rather than a command, a target rather than a law. The narrative emphasizes this softly. The suggested figure is neither definitive nor scientific. It is a heuristic for imagining mass influence. As the days lengthened into a few weeks, John kept his practice private. He is not a proselytizer by nature, but his quietness had a contagion of its own. People noticed, and when asked what had changed, he did not use the language of fields or frequency with them. He used simpler words, steadier presence, listening, small deliberate warmth. When pressed about the night in the field, he told what he could, but he always returned to what the presence had insisted upon, the centrality of felt memory. At this point in John's story, I need to widen the frame, because the account, and why it matters, is not only about one man in a field. The presence put his small narrative in relation to a larger pattern. It showed him not a cosmic plan of doom, but a schematic of erosion, a decline in relational capacity that shows up across generations, institutions, and cultures. The being's images traced lines between phenomena we might separately term: the rise in chronic anxiety, the shortening of attention spans, the commodification of intimacy through screens, the way political conflict often seeks to score rather than to restore. Each of these, in the presence's teaching, is both cause and symptom, a knot where inner and outer feed into one another. There is an urgency to this diagnosis, but not hysteria. The warning is sober. We can be made hollow by habits that are cumulative, not catastrophic. It's said, in effect, that the apocalypse we must fear is internal, a condition that allows cruelty, indifference, and ideological certainty to flourish because the heart has been trained to harden rather than to hold.
Imagine a species that can email, farm, organize nations, and yet cannot be moved by a neighbor's grief. That is the horizon John was shown. Toward the end of that night, and this is where the narrative turns, the presence pushed beyond diagnosis and began to propose an approach. It did not hand over a mechanical cure. It proposed a methodology, a set of attention practices anchored in bodily felt memory designed to restore the heart's coherence. It spoke in minimalities. Practice often. Begin with small windows of time. Cultivate evocative memories that generate warmth. Protect those states from corrosive input, and slowly extend radiance into daily interactions. It framed these practices as complementary to other forms of care: psychological, medical, pastoral. The presence was careful. It never suggested people abandon professionals or ignore physical ailments. It positioned its teaching as a bridge to interior health, not as a replacement for medicine or therapy. How did John react then? The first blend of awe and doubt yielded to a slow, disciplined curiosity. He tried a sitting practice at dawn, just 5 minutes at first, placing attention in the heart and evoking the memory of his daughter's tied shoe. The sensation that arose was not magical, it was solid, anchored in muscle and breath. He noticed his breathing lengthen and his agitation ease. He kept doing it. The practice, simple as it was, began to puncture the numbness with small openings. Before I go further in the story, I want to make a crucial methodological point on behalf of the account and on behalf of responsible interpretation. Experiences of this sort, where a presence reframes sacred texts and offers practical techniques, occupy an interpretive space that requires humility. They are neither a new scripture nor a dismissal of existing faith. They are testimonies of a person who encountered something that made internal sense to him and then shaped his behavior accordingly. As you listen, I ask you to hold two things together: the reality of personal testimony and the legitimacy of critical inquiry. Both are necessary to make sense of what follows. In the weeks after the field, John continued. His sleep ebbed and returned in cycles. He kept a small practice at dawn, longer during Sundays when Mary and he sat with their coffee, and shorter micro-practices when he found himself on the tractor. He began to use a language of presence with Mary that had nothing to do with proselytizing and everything to do with noticing. "Tell me what that felt like," he would say. "Stay with it. Let me listen." Those small phrases shifted the tempo of their marriage from cohabitation to companionship. Harold, when he visited, started to bring stories that were briefer but that landed in a different register. People around John's life felt lighter, as if some piece of static had been turned down. We cannot, in this first section, confirm global transformation.
That comes later in the story of timelines and experiments, but we do have a set of emergent themes: a diagnosis that frames Jesus' warnings as potentially about inner erosion, an encounter that reframed love as a practicable state, a method that begins with memory and breath, and a tentative set of cultural implications that suggest small practices, aggregated, can shift collective fields. Before the presence left John that night, it gave him a final image, an ordinary house on a plain, lights glowing, a family gathered around a small table, and the space between them thick with an ease that looked like an unspoken permission to be known. The presence did not promise utopia. It did not offer instant fixes. It offered a map for cultivation and an insistence on the moral seriousness of small things. John woke at dawn not with a proclamation, but with a choice to follow a practice he had been shown and to notice what changed. He began to write down the shifts. He told Mary what he was doing, and she listened. That choice, to practice and to narrate, is the hinge of the story. In the next part of the account, the field's teachings become more specific. There are structured practices, timelines for measurable change, and a careful discussion of protections and boundaries for those who attempt this work. There is also pushback, natural skepticism, and the social dynamics that attend any experiment that touches the heart. For now, though, we stand at the edge of an ordinary life that was made extraordinary by one night of attention and by a presence that reframed an ancient admonition into something that could be practiced, embodied, and tested in daily life. If what you've heard here feels like a possibility, not a dogma, but a hypothesis worth testing in your own body, notice that the invitation is small and immediate. Slow your breath, place attention in the center of your chest, and recall a memory that generates genuine warmth. Hold that feeling for 30 seconds. See if anything around you answers. And if you are struggling with persistent panic, depression, or sleep loss, please consult a professional. The practices described in this account are complementary to clinical care, not a substitute. John kept practicing. He kept noting the changes. He kept his story mostly private, but the moment in the field had changed his priorities. He returned to the rhythm of chores with a different interior commitment, to be a little more present, a little more patient, a little more intent on generating warmth where numbness had taken root. The ripple began at the porch light and slowly reached beyond the fence line. That night in the field had offered him a new lens through which to read an ancient warning. Whether the interpreter was a being from another world, or a symbol, or an interior guide, is a question John left for other people to analyze. For him, the proof was not metaphysical or doctrinal. It was practical. A steadying in the chest, a wife's softened look, a neighbor's easier laugh. The presence had not arrived to replace Scripture or to overthrow tradition. It had arrived, in John's telling, like a friend bringing a map to a familiar road he had walked for years but never seen from above. It named a slow rot and suggested a method for repair. The story does not stop there. The presence had more to show, and John had more to try. The evenings ahead would involve experiments, mistakes, and resistance. The question hanging over that first night, the one that turns personal practice into a movement, is this: if small practices of heart coherence can produce local shifts, what happens if thousands, then millions, practice them and sustain them? What happens when the drops over time begin to form a lake? When dawn came fully and the tractor had to be started anyway, John walked inside, kissed Mary awake, and tried to keep the new warmth in his chest as he went about the work he could not avoid. The presence's last word in the field, as best as he could remember, was not a command, but an encouragement. Begin where you are. Begin where you are. The ordinary work of the farm framed the experiment that followed. There were fences to mend, calves to check, and a small world of chores that would have swallowed any unusual night into routine if John had let it. He did not let it. Instead, he treated the night like a map he'd been given, not a spectacle to be shouted from rooftops, but a set of directions to follow on foot, day by day. For the next week, he kept the practice intentionally small. He rose before the sun twice, sometimes 3 times a week, and sat on the back step with a mug gone cold if the tractor called him early. He set a timer on his phone for 20 minutes on the days he could spare it, and for 5 minutes on the busier mornings. The instructions the presence had given, as John remembered them, were simple and repeatable. They formed a 3-part foundation that he folded into his life. The first foundation was intention, to orient attention toward a felt memory that genuinely generated warmth. This was not about forcing gratitude or reciting platitudes. It required a memory precise enough to evoke somatic response, the weight of a child's small hand, the smell of soup a mother once made, the tilt of a friend's head as they listened without planning a reply. The presence emphasized authenticity, a memory that actually made the chest soften. John learned to sample memories until he found the ones that landed with a believable warmth. The second foundation was breath, a regulated, heart-centered rhythm meant to steady the nervous system and anchor attention in the chest.
The technical outline was practical. Breathe into the chest area with a count of 5 seconds on the inhale and 5 seconds on the exhale, allowing the breath to be felt in the space behind the sternum rather than only in the belly or the throat. The guidance was explicit but non-mechanical. Keep the lungs comfortable, avoid strain, and let the breath be a carrier for the felt memory. On good days, the breath and memory braided together, producing a steady glow at the core of his experience. On hard days, the breath kept him from spiraling into worry. The third foundation was boundary. Protect the cultivated state from corrosive inputs and learn simple ways to clear absorbed fear. This involved practical steps: reduce exposure to sensational news, pause before diving into heated conversations, and develop a brief clearing routine after contact with stressful people or images. The presence taught John a 3-step clear. Exhale the image or emotion with an audible ah, not theatrical, but physically expressed. Place attention back into the heart for 30 seconds and name one ordinary thing for which his body felt gratitude. The ritual was neither mysterious nor magical. It was a small reorientation so the nervous system could let go. I want to be explicit about one thing. These foundations are offered as an experiential protocol, not as an untested cure. John treated them as practices to test, like a gardener experimenting with a new seed variety on the corner of the field. He invited Mary to try them once, not as a conversion tactic, but as a shared experiment in getting better sleep. She humored him the first week and then surprised herself by asking for a second sitting. When that happened, John felt something inside him shift from private duty to communal possibility. The regimen that grew out of these foundations became for John a disciplined scaffolding rather than a one-off epiphany. It had a rhythm. 20 minutes most mornings, composed of 3 blocks. The first block was 5 minutes of gentle settling. Sit, rest hands on the knees, and scan the body for tension, letting attention sink into the chest. The second block was 10 minutes of heart breathing, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, with the memory held lightly but persistently in the chest area. The third block was radiating. Imagine the warmth extending a meter beyond the skin, then 3 meters, then to the porch, then to the neighbor's fence, not as a wish, but as an embodied sense of contact. Those last steps felt odd at first. Imagining warmth extending outward felt like toy magic, but the practice was less about metaphysical claims and more about training a posture,
Attention moves from self-protective contraction to outward openness while remaining grounded. The presence framed the practice as a discipline of radiance. The heart attunes, the nervous system regulates, the person becomes available in a different register.
John kept a small notebook by the coffee pot and wrote down what he noticed. The first line read simply, "Week 1 slept 3 hours." That was an improvement. By week 2, he could sleep 5 hours and felt, in the middle of the night, a capacity to return to breath rather than to ruminate. He reported to me, months later, that the early morning sits felt less like work and more like a quiet muscle that, when exercised, made other movements easier. There were always bad days. The farm is a place where weather and machinery conspire to define your mood. Once, a storm collapsed a barn roof, and for several days, John's mind was all lists and insurance calls. Practice took a back seat. When he returned to the porch, the first breath back felt foreign. He had to be kind to himself about lapse and return. The presence's teaching, if we can call it that, had insisted on a kind of steady patience. Small gains accumulate, but resistance is natural. As John practiced, changes rippled outward in modest ways. Mary noticed his ear had changed. He listened to her with fewer solutions in hand. Harold, who had come for eggs and stayed for longer stories, started asking about his grandchildren and then, unconsciously at first, waiting for the answer rather than speaking over it. The church potluck conversations moved from headline breathing to slower sentences that allowed questions to be answered rather than shouted down. An exchange like that, ordinary, unreported, human scale, is what the presence called field repair. Networked acts of presence that don't require institutions or experts to be real. Not everyone appreciated or accepted John's account. The pastor who baptized his son greeted the story warily. At a Wednesday study group, a retired school teacher asked whether John had been sleepwalking or experiencing a vivid dream. A friend from the county seat suggested that the pattern he described, anxiety, distractedness, relational thinning, had political and economic causes that needed policy remedies rather than inward practices. Those critiques were useful. They kept John's account honest. He did not claim the practice as a substitution for systemic reform. Instead, he argued that inner coherence and outer justice are complementary. A warmed, attentive heart is not an excuse to avoid needed structural change. Rather, it is the ground from which sustainable action comes. In conversations I had with leaders who heard the story, that distinction mattered. The presence had never asked John to neglect the work of structural repair. It had asked him to begin where he was and to notice whether the small changes in his family affected how he engaged the larger world. If the practice was a beginning, the presence also emphasized protections, specific, practical moves people should make before and after exposure to stressful media, arguments, or intense social situations. These protections were as much about nervous system hygiene as about metaphysics.
Some clergy worried the language of frequency and fields could be misunderstood or turned into a cosmetic spirituality that avoids grief. Others felt the alien reframing of Jesus' sayings might be seen as a novelty that distracts from centuries of theological reflection. These concerns are important. I mention them not to dismiss the presence's account, but to acknowledge that any new interpretive frame must be held in conversation with tradition and reason. Still, there is something methodologically interesting in how the presence framed the Beatitudes and parables, not to replace their moral content, but to add an embodied element, a physiological correlative to the ethic. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom within, the presence suggested, he pointed to an interior capacity that required cultivation. It is one thing to preach mercy. It is another to train the metal of the body to receive and enact mercy in split-second choices. The presence's teaching married moral exhortation to somatic training. By the third month, John kept a small log. He tracked sleep hours, episodes of sharp reactivity, and times he felt the chest warmth in routine interactions. The log was not a clinical diary, but a practical gauge. On average, he reported clearer sleep, more generous listening, and a reduction in the sense of living behind glass. Mary, who was always the more pragmatic partner, started a weekly Sunday sitting in which they did the 20-minute practice together and then talked for 10 minutes about a specific moment when one felt seen or healed in the past week. That ritual changed the texture of their weekend. The narrative the presence offered also proposed a timeline for more extensive change at scale. It claimed, cautiously, that individuals would experience glimpses in 2 to 3 weeks, measurable relational shifts in 3 to 6 months, and deeper cultural effects in 1 to 2 years if the practice was widely adopted. Remember, these are heuristic timeframes from an eyewitness account. They are not scientific forecasts. John used them as goals rather than as guarantees. He invited neighbors and friends to make short-term commitments, 2 weeks, try this and report back, rather than a lifetime vow. That was wise. Short-term commitments lower the barrier for entry and allow for real-world testing. A few months in, an unplanned experiment emerged. A small group of 3 neighbors, John, Mary, and Harold, decided to try a community variation. On alternate mornings, they sat on one of the porches and did their practice. Sometimes a 4th person, a young teacher from across the road, joined. They were quiet about it because they didn't want to look like they had formed a club. After 6 weeks, one of them organized a potluck with the intent of seeing whether the settled practice affected group dynamics. At the potluck, people lingered longer at tables. Arguments that in years past might have escalated into sideshow theatrics were resolved with shorter silences, and a teenager who had been sullen and defensive came home smiling. Those are small things, but they were material, not anecdotal in the sense of a single eccentric story, but repeated enough to warrant curiosity. Word began to spread, not in a sensationalist way, but through neighborly reports. John's been sleeping better. Mary seems different. Harold looks well. The diffusion was organic, and that mattered. When a practice spreads because it works for people's lived experience, it reduces the risk of being mistaken for fashionable doctrine. People asked for a simple guide, not a manifesto. That was the need the ebook in the pinned comment aimed to meet. A practical manual outlining the 3 foundations, scripts for the practice, short clearing rituals, and suggestions for introducing it to families and small groups. The guide was pragmatic, not dogmatic. At this point, several themes coalesced into a more public test of sorts. A teacher in town introduced a 1-minute heart-breathing habit before class twice a week, and a kindergarten teacher reported fewer meltdowns. A counselor at the local clinic mentioned that some patients who included heart-centered breathwork in their care reported better heart rate variability on wearable devices. She caveated that by noting these were anecdotal and not controlled trials, but it opened a conversation between pastoral practices and clinical care. That cautious dialogue was precisely what the Presence's method had invited, collaboration rather than replacement. I must emphasize again the limits. The Presence never promised that heart work would cure disease or replace therapy. When someone in John's circle had a history of trauma and flashbacks, the guidance was explicit: continue with clinical treatment and use the practice as an adjunct under supervision. This line of mutual respect prevented the emergence of cultish promises and kept the practice within healthy boundaries. Not all outcomes were positive. Once, a church elder accused John of inventing a new spirituality to attract attention. There were local gossip threads that treated the story as either naive or dangerous. John weathered those critiques with a kind of rural stoicism. He did not seek approval. He kept his log, kept practicing, and let the evidence of daily life speak. That steadiness matters. In the story the presence gave him, it was never about drawing crowds. It was about attention, discipline, and reparative practice. By 6 months, several patterns had become clearer. John's sleep was more stable, with deeper periods of uninterrupted rest. Mary felt less reactive. Their conversations developed an aftertaste of patience. Harold's headaches were rare enough that he mentioned them only in passing now.
The small school reported fewer severe outbursts on days the teacher used a brief pre-class practice. Anecdotal as these outcomes were, they were consistent and repeated in different contexts across the county. This raised a question the presence had posed earlier. What happens when thousands of people adopt these small practices? I asked John if he felt naive about even imagining a broader social effect. He was candid. "There's no guarantee," he said, "but I do know what happens in my kitchen and on my porch, and that's good enough to keep going." That pragmatism is central. Movement begins with fidelity to small embodied practices rather than with grandiose visions. There is also a moral component the presence underscored. Love, in this account, is not a sentimental feeling. It is a practice that requires discipline and courage because it exposes us to grief and to responsibility. Strengthening the heart's capacity does not inoculate a person against pain. It places them in closer contact with pain and therefore more available for repair. That is the paradox. Cultivating warmth also means learning to steward vulnerability. John's months included moments of grief that felt sharper precisely because he could feel more. He attended funerals with a tenderer presence and found himself both more available and more sorrowful. That depth, not detachment, was the presence's aim. Around month 8, a modest but meaningful experiment took shape. A cluster of 3 families in the adjacent township committed to practicing the 20-minute session together via a weekly video call. They did not meet to proselytize. They met to test whether synchronous practice enhanced the sense of connectedness. The answer, for them, was yes. Synchronous practice seemed to create an immediate sense of shared intention that lingered through the week. One mother reported that her child's playground conflicts decreased on days that followed the family sitting. Another father said the ritual gave him a pause he otherwise did not have before making reactive comments at work. We should treat these reports with caution. There is a classic difficulty in social experiments. Expectation effects can shape outcomes. People who expect benefit may notice benefits more readily. The responsible response is to test, observe, and adjust. In John's network, that meant small, low-cost trials. Try 2 weeks and report. Try 6 weeks and compare notes. If something fails, abandon it. That practical rigor allowed the community to stay humble and avoid miraculous claims. At roughly 10 months into the project, John was invited to speak at a small ecumenical gathering in a nearby town. He did not go as an evangelist of an alien revelation. He went to describe a set of practices he had found helpful and to be transparent about the limits and uncertainties. The response was mixed. Some found hope and practical wisdom in his testimony. Others remained skeptical or unconvinced.
The important thing was that dialogue began between practitioners, pastors, clinicians, and curious neighbors, rather than an insular echo chamber. During that public conversation, I found myself asking the same question many listeners will ask. What about Jesus? Did this account diminish his authority or reframe it in a way that sidelines Scripture? The careful answer, both in John's telling and in the presence's framing, is that Jesus was used as a translator, not a superseder. The presence did not claim to replace the Gospels. It proposed a reading, a lens through which to consider certain sayings as descriptions of interior phenomena.
For Christians who hear this and feel worried, the invitation is to treat the reframing as one interpretive possibility among many, not as a requirement. Importantly, the Presence's teaching did not advocate for withdrawal from the world. It imagined a kind of engaged presence, people practicing coherence not to become spiritual tourists, but to be more effective in tending neighbors, supporting grieving families, volunteering at shelters, and participating in civic life with less reactivity. The practice was framed as a fuel for sustained compassionate action, a substrate for endurance rather than an escape hatch. At this point in John's story, the notion of scale reappeared. The Presence had once offered a heuristic number that resembled a quorum, a sense that at some threshold of adopters a field could tip. This never felt like a prophecy to John. It felt like a thought experiment that might help people imagine what collective care could look like. He spoke of tens of thousands rather than millions, and urged people not to fixate on numbers, but on practices. There is ethical clarity here. Movement building should not create coercive pressure or spiritual vanity. Instead, it should model generosity, humility, and mutual accountability. Parallel to communal experiments, the method required ethical safeguards. John and several neighbors agreed on a modest set of community norms to prevent fragmentation and misuse. No promises of guaranteed healing, transparency about psychological limitations, immediate referral to professionals when trauma emerged, discouraging recruitment tactics that implied spiritual superiority, and encouraging open evaluation of outcomes. Those guardrails mattered because practices that touch the heart can be misused by those seeking power. One winter evening, nearly a year into his practice, John received a call that was both ordinary and revealing. His grandson had been caught in a schoolyard scuffle and was anxious about returning to class. John met the child with his presence practice and a simple question: "What happened to make you feel that way?" He did not have a sermon or a solution, only a patient ear anchored by breath. The child relaxed enough to speak. That practical moment, not a headline or a viral story, felt to John like the work the Presence had called him to.
It was small, messy, and deeply human. There were also collective setbacks. A church committee that had been curious about the practice decided to distance itself after an internal faction argued that the language of aliens and fields was theologically suspect. That loss stung some who had hoped for institutional partnership. But other churches invited conversation and pragmatic workshops. This uneven reception was predictable and instructive. New narratives intersecting with long-standing traditions will always produce debate. The responsible posture is one of listening and mutual respect. As the calendar moved into the second year, more structured tracking took place. A local health clinic agreed to a small pilot study in which volunteers who practiced daily logged their sleep patterns, stress scores, and perceived relationship quality over 6 months. The study was small and methodologically limited, but it was a start. Preliminary results suggested modest improvements in subjective sleep quality and perceived emotional regulation among those who adhered to the practice. The clinic published a cautious note: "More rigorous study is needed." The tone of that note was exactly what the Presence had advocated all along: curiosity rather than certainty. Perhaps the most revealing development came from those who had practiced consistently for a year or longer. People described a qualitative shift, the presence of grief closer to the surface, but also a steadier capacity to meet it without being undone. Some reported being less compelled by partisan fury. Others said they were calmer parents. None claimed perfection. Many described the practice as akin to a long-term habit, like running or prayer. Improvements compounded over time,
plateaus occurred and lapses were inevitable. That long arc frames the central claim embedded in the title that brought you here. Discover the alien truth Jesus tried to warn us about. The discovery in John's story is not a cosmic conspiracy or a neat theological correction. It is a practical reframing. Jesus' admonitions may include warning about the slow erosion of our capacity to love. The alien presence, whether literal or symbolic, served as a catalyst for a set of practices aimed at reversing that erosion. The real test of any such claim is in living it out, not in endorsing or rejecting metaphysical scaffolding without experimenting with the practices. The urgency in the narrative remains sober rather than hysterical. There is a window for reversal, and the work required is patient discipline rather than instant heroics. If people adopt simple practices consistently, the story suggests, social atmospheres can become more reparative. If they do not, the more plausible consequence is not a fiery end, but a slow cultural attrition, societies functioning on the surface while suffering an internal decline in mutual responsiveness. As with any experiment in communal life, there are ethical and practical challenges. One is avoiding moral smugness. Cultivating a clean heart should not be used to shame the struggling or to justify avoiding systemic change. Another is avoiding privatization of salvation. Heart work is necessary but insufficient. Collective repair requires policy, institutions, and public care. The Presence's narrative guarded against those extremes by insisting on both interior cultivation and outward action. When I asked John whether he felt a sense of mission at this stage, he described something quieter. "I feel responsible," he said. "Not responsible to convert, but responsible to show up in ways that help others breathe. If someone asks, I'll show them. If they don't, I won't push." That humility is essential for the integrity of the work. Before closing this chapter of his story, I want to provide the concrete practice as it evolved in John's handbook. This is offered as an experiential tool, a script for practice, described in plain language with safety notes. Find a quiet place where you can sit comfortably for 20 minutes in the morning. A back step, a chair by a window, or a quiet corner will do. Posture. Sit with your spine upright but relaxed. Rest your hands on your thighs or in your lap. Grounding. Take 3 full breaths to settle. Feel your feet on the floor if seated, or your sit bones on the chair. Heart focus. Place your attention in the center of your chest, near the sternum. Do not force anything, simply notice the area. Memory evocation. Bring to mind a specific sensory memory that genuinely generates warmth, the exact memory you felt earlier, not an abstract gratitude list. Allow it to emerge as if you can feel the textures, sounds, and small details. Breathing rhythm. Inhale for 5 seconds and exhale for 5 seconds. Feel the breath in the chest rather than only in the belly. Keep the breath comfortable, do not strain. Hold the memory gently throughout the breath cycle. Do not try to analyze or produce feelings. The memory will sometimes deepen the warmth and sometimes lag. Stay patient. Radiate. After 10 minutes, imagine the warmth expanding a small distance beyond your skin, like a dim halo. Let this be a felt sense more than an image. Closing. After 20 minutes, return attention to the whole body. Feel your feet on the floor and take 3 normal breaths. Name aloud or in the mind one ordinary thing you are grateful for. If you've been exposed to something stressful during the day, use the 3-step decontamination. 1 audible exhalation on ah, 30 seconds of heart breath, and then a gratitude naming. Safety notes. If you have a history of trauma, panic disorder, or severe mental health concerns, consult a mental health professional before beginning intensive breath work. Use the practice as a complement, not a substitute for medical or psychological treatment. If you feel dissociated or overwhelmed during practice, stop, ground by noticing 3 physical sensations, e.g., feel your feet, touch your hands, and seek professional support if distress persists. This protocol is deliberately modest and practical. It offers no guarantees. It is an invitation to test and report back. The final months of the second year were telling in ways that were not dramatic but meaningful. John and Mary celebrated their 42nd anniversary with a small dinner. They sat longer at the table than typical couples around town. Old irritations came up and were resolved with less fury. Harold gave a longer, softer laugh. The neighbor teenager, who weeks prior had been edgy and argumentative, began helping carry hay bales and, on slow afternoons, would sit quietly and ask questions about how John kept going. At a community level, the aggregate of these small shifts did not cause a revolution. It did, however, make certain neighborhoods gentler. People who had once answered calls with impatience began to answer with more listening. School disciplinary incidents did not evaporate, but some conflicts were managed with more attention to repair. That is the realistic and, in some ways, radical claim. Ordinary people cultivating steady inner work are not powerless. They change the texture of proximate communities by showing up differently. I end with a sober invitation, not as a salesman, but as someone who has watched an ordinary life shifted by a practice and believes that small things matter. The title that brought you here, arresting as it is, points toward a discovery. An encounter reframed ancient warnings about the heart, and from that encounter came a set of practices that can be tested in daily life. If you feel called to try this, begin with the tiny experiment we rehearsed. Slow your breath, place attention in the center of your chest, recall a precise memory that warms you, and hold it for 30 seconds. See what answers. If you want a practical manual that outlines the 3 foundations, scripts for couple or family practice, and suggestions for protections and community experiments, the ebook in the pinned comment offers that material in a compact form. For those looking for personalized guidance, there are limited private sessions available, described in the same link. They are designed for people who want deeper coaching in integrating the practice with clinical support or pastoral care. Finally, if this story touched you in any way, subscribe for more explorations that sit at the intersection of ancient wisdom and everyday life, and consider sharing a short comment about a small practice you might try this week. The work of repair begins with single acts repeated faithfully. Whether the catalyst is an extraordinary night in a field or a simple choice to breathe differently, the point remains: begin where you are and practice. We do not know if a global shift will come from these small acts.
What we do know from John's life and from the people around him is that hearts can be worn soft again, and that the labor of attention matters. The warning Jesus spoke of, as reframed in this account, is not, finally, an inevitability, but a summons. It asks us to cultivate a capacity to be present, to listen, and to keep practicing the small things that heal the world from the inside out.